Welcome to Lawgical, the UAE's first, still the only regular legal podcast. My name's Tim Elliott. Lawgical comes to you from the Dubai-based legal firm HPL Yamalova and Pletka. And as ever, here is the managing partner, Ludmila Yamalova. Nice to see you.
Great to see you too, Tim, especially here in our new setup. You look a lot more comfortable.
I am reclining happily today. Thank you. Normally you sit me at a desk.
Exactly. We tried the desk, but I thought this time around we can do a different setup and see if our creative juices will flow more creatively in this more leisurely format.
Let me know if that happens. Now, look, today I'm going to go straight from a light mood to this is a reasonably sort of sensitive topic, I guess, particularly here in the UAE, drugs in the Emirates. Specifically, though, today, let's talk about cannabis or marijuana. Now, historically, the UAE's been categorically intolerant when it comes to, I guess, narcotics, illegal drugs. We've discussed changes to the penal code on this podcast fairly recently, and you can find that online. But we've seen some changes, haven't we, with regard to, I guess, legal attitudes to drugs, it would be fair to say.
Indeed, as you rightfully said, and as we discussed this topic in our previous podcast, prior to 2021, which is only about 2 years ago, the UAE had unequivocal and categorical position towards any form of drugs. And basically, as per the previous approach, the UAE stance, all drugs were more or less created equal, meaning they were all illegal at all levels, irrespective of whether of what type of drug it was, what purpose it was brought in, the amount of it, in what sort of form, and so on and so forth. It's just anything related to any form of drug, including cannabis or marijuana. They were all treated the same way, which was basic. It was illegal, one, and it was always in all circumstances resulted in a form of a jail sentence. In most cases, it was at least 2 years of jail sentence, some financial fines, and ultimately deportation. And that was just kind of the general stance in the UAE legal system with regards to any type of drugs and in any kind of form or shape. That, as we've discussed previously, changed to an extent in 2021. So the previous law that ultimately criminalized any drugs in any form or shape was the federal law number 14 of 1995. So obviously a very old law, and at the time the UAE was still a very new country, and so it's not surprising that the law was drafted so categorically and unequivocally the way it was, and it was interpreted and applied all these years as it had been. Now, I guess changing with the times, in 2021, the UAE, as part of its general legislative reform, changed a number of laws, and one of which was this particular federal law number 14, which ultimately was repealed altogether. So it wasn't just amended, it was repealed altogether. And instead of that law, a new law was introduced, which was the Anti-Narcotics and Psychotropic Substances Law, which was the federal decree law number 30 of 2021. So as part of this law, there were a number of changes, and it's a fairly robust legislative product, if you will, in the sense that it differentiates between different types of drugs. It differentiates in terms of the number of offenses. It differentiates in terms of the substance and the form in which that particular drug or substance may be brought into the country or used in the country. It differentiates between the purpose, whether it's consumption versus possession versus trade, and so on and so forth. So it's a fairly complex and detailed legislative work product. And as a result, as part of this legislative framework, this particular document is followed by a number of schedules. And truly, you need to be a chemist, you need to be a scientist to understand how to read these schedules, because it delves into different types of drugs, not just perhaps the more commonly known narcotics or kind of recreational drugs, but also prescription drugs. So this particular law sets out different schedules for different different types of drugs, and there's a lot more detail in terms of the types of drugs, the variation of drugs. You need to be a scientist to be able to kind of understand them. But one of the kind of extrapolated conclusions or premises of this new law is that cannabis in general is treated somewhat differently from all the other drugs. Cannabis, marijuana, whatever the different variations and derivatives are. And this is why we're talking about this particular, in this podcast about this particular topic, which is cannabis, for many reasons, because it's a lot more perhaps in other parts of the world known as a more recreational and kind of a common drug. But the I guess the overall I don't want to say kind of conclusion, but perhaps wanted conclusion for many from this new law was, oh my goodness, the UAE decriminalized drugs. So it's the drugs are no longer illegal, in particular cannabis. And so that's why we've seen perhaps a lot more relaxed approach and hence more cases of people coming into the UAE, residents and tourists fine, but even residents, including sort of thinking or expecting for the UAE to be a lot more relaxed in terms of how it treats drugs. And it's because of this overall perhaps kind of high level sentiment again, but the law is very clear. The drugs in any form are still illegal. It's just that the punishment perhaps is a little more lax, or is a little more varied depending on the types of drug we're talking about.
Right. I mean, we've got the situation in the US where in some states cannabis, marijuana production, sale, I guess, however you want to frame it, in some states in the US, it is legal to buy, sell, consume marijuana in certain quantities, and it is regulated by the government. And I guess by that yardstick, if you like, attitudes are kind of changing. There are also some medicinal qualities in cannabis use, I guess, and there are prescriptions for that, not here in the UAE. But the point is, and I think it's worth reiterating, that there is no legalization of drugs here in the UAE, but drugs, if you like, are categorized in a different way under the law. Is that how we should be reading this?
Exactly. So first of all, to highlight and kind of reiterate and make it very clear that the UAE stance on drugs in general still more or less remains the same, which is drugs are illegal in the UAE. Now, in terms of the punishment as compared to how drugs were treated before, which was unequivocal, categorical, doesn't matter what kind of drugs and what quantity, they are bad, you're a criminal, you go to jail, and then you get deported. Compared to that treatment, now there is a more lenient treatment and more lenient punishment, therefore, for the types of drugs. So, but still, the premise remains the same. Drugs are illegal. However, if it is, for example, cannabis, marijuana, the punishment is a little less. So, and it's exactly for the reason you just mentioned, because perhaps opinions can matter or can differ on this particular topic, but I guess by at least accounts of many, marijuana is considered to be more of a kind of a recreational, perhaps less of a dangerous drug than, for example, cocaine or heroin or for sort of hardcore drugs, right? Mm-hmm. And because of that, that particular drug, or however you want the substance, if you want to call it that, in so many other countries has been accepted as more or less a recreational drug and also medicinal drugs, and it's more or less, in some places it's regulated a little more than in others, but in many places it's not even really much regulated anymore. So therefore it becomes, perhaps has more of a reputation as being more ubiquitous, kind of like almost like cigarettes, right? And cigarettes are to an extent regulated, but not really, they're not illegal. So because of that, and a lot of people, and this is not one country, this is not just the US, right? It's in Europe, the Netherlands, for example. So many other countries are a lot more lenient with regards to this particular cannabis or marijuana type of substance. As a result, people obviously that come from those cultures, come from those countries, they're a lot more relaxed. They're a lot more lackadaisical about not just consuming these sort of drugs, but also perhaps traveling with them and having them stuck in their suitcases or in their sort of pockets. So they're a lot less concerned about, okay, well, I'm leaving my country, going to a different country. I need to check all my clothing and all my suitcases, make sure that I have nothing on me. So presumably that's kind of why. And this is the reason we're doing this podcast today. Well, we've seen an increase in cases, just like the one I mentioned. We've had a number of cases since this new law came into effect. There have been a lot more cases, and we've seen these cases firsthand here at the firm, where people doing exactly that. An American, for example, flying in for a wedding into the UAE, and just kind of over the week before he came to the UAE, he traveled from one state, from New York to California, and then California basically, and then he flew back to New York, but using the same suitcase. And then in the suitcase he had a little bit of cannabis, a little packet of cannabis in his suitcase, and because he had been traveling previously within the United States, between different states, where it's legal having that kind of amount on your possession, on your person is legal. So, and he used the same suitcase to fly into the UAE. Right. Well, lo and behold, there's a little bit of cannabis that was stuck in his suitcase, kind of in the front pocket, that he claims, and I tend to believe him, he didn't even know about it, because the way it was discovered is when he landed in Dubai airport. He was apprehended and they asked him to open the suitcase. He very openly opened the suitcase, and this thing just fell out of the front pocket of the suitcase. So to me, that's kind of a sign that he wasn't really trying to bring it. He wasn't really consciously hiding it. It kind of just was in plain view and just fell out. And his explanation to that was that, well, I did not know I had it on me. So that's one example. So, and then recently we had another example where a person also flies in with a little bit of cannabis on them as well, and they get apprehended at the airport, and this person is from China, for example, and they're like, oh, what, we cannot use this is illegal. So these number of cases are increasing because of this overall expectation, sentiment, and it's in the wake of obviously legislative changes. And this is why we thought that the timing is it's a good time right now to kind of remind people of the UAE's legal stance on drugs in general, and cannabis in particular, because that is much more of a common substance that people feel a lot more relaxed and forgetful in many ways to have it on the person, themselves, or in their suitcases and their clothing. And coming to the UAE, not even asking the question, is it legal or not?
Yeah, okay. So is possession of cannabis treated differently in the UAE, and how is it? What's the expectation now when you come in the country, for example, and something like that does happen inadvertently? You've just forgotten. What could you expect now, as opposed to historically?
Right. So historically, if you were to fly in that example, or the examples that I just used, if the same person that had a little bit of cannabis, marijuana in his suitcase, and he was stopped at the airport, he'd be taken to ultimately jail, serve his time in jail for a year or two, depending on sort of circumstances. But the law at the time prescribed 2 years, by the way, and then ultimately deported. So there wouldn't be literally they would be taken from the airport straight to the police station to jail, and then they will not have seen that much of the country at all beyond the airport and the prison. Right. So that's how it was before. Now, as you rightfully said, the law differentiates between. Let's going to focus for the purposes of today's discussion just cannabis, and it differentiates anything related to cannabis. There's a lot more provisions in the law that make it very clear this particular substance is treated very differently, and then two, with regards to, again, cannabis, marijuana, whatever the various medicinal scientific terms are, there is also whether it's the amount of it, how it's being, whether it's being brought into the country or and being it's in possession versus use, whether it's being used, and in what form, whether it's just the substance itself or it's mixed with different kinds of products, and whether it's the person's first time, a second time, a third time, whether it's in their blood, and so on and so forth. So there's different kind of designations, and this all comes down to in terms of punishment. So that's just the overall framework. Now, with regards to if you could just drill it down in terms of what does the law specifically state for the different types of possession versus trading versus use and such. Yeah. So first of all, just for those who are interested in terms of the schedules that talk about cannabis in particular, there's like, for example, Schedule 1, and it's Clause 29 that talks about specifically cannabis resin, and extracts and tinctures of cannabis. Again, you need to be a scientist. And then there's Schedule 4, Part 2, Clause A, that specifically talks about cannabis sativa. Again, forgive me for mispronunciation of these technical terms. And then there's a Schedule 5, Clause 34, for example, that talks about THC, and I don't even want to pronounce the actual scientific word. THC, I think everybody knows. And there's also a Schedule 6, Clause 4, which talks about Delta 9 THC and its stereochemical variants. So the reason I'm going through this list of schedules is just to show or demonstrate how detailed this new law is, how complex it is, and how it actually, there's quite a bit of forethought that's put in the legislative framework in terms of truly separating this specific scientific substance.
See, that's what jumps out to me. It's the consideration of, and we're talking specifically about cannabis at the moment for the purposes of this recording, but it's the consideration of this narcotic, because in so many other places it's socially acceptable, it's used widely, it's not here in the UAE. But the point is, the country, the law regulates cannabis in a considered fashion, as opposed to historically when it was, okay, one strike, you're out. That's not the case anymore.
Exactly. So, and that's a great way to summarize it, because back then, until 2021, so many people ended up exactly in that situation. Yeah. And the one strike you're out means that one strike you're out forever. Yeah. Because once you have been deported from the UAE, and that's after you've served your 2-year jail, at least 2-year jail, there's deportations for life. So there's no way of coming back. And that's that. Whereas now the examples, and we can talk about the specific examples as we go through the discussion, but those examples I just made, people actually did not serve time in jail. And in most cases, they left the country without ever seeing jail, and left the country without even a deportation or any kind of a court order. So just this is kind of a bit of a teaser or cliffhanger. We can go through the specific case studies a little later. But going back to your previous point about, okay, so now we talk about cannabis and the different variants of the same, right? Okay, now, this is we're talking the substance. Now, what is the substance what are you doing with the substance? So there is the difference in terms of use. So there is the potential, you using the substance, i.e. using cannabis, or you're possessing it. So using, you can have it on you, but you may not be using it, right? So you can use it but not possess it. So, or you can have both, or there's trading. So obviously anything to do with trading is very different. So because trading and export and import in particular are treated very differently from, if you want to just at a high level categorize it, there's the general kind of possession, your personal possession, just for me, whether I'm using it or I just have it on me. And obviously the amounts in that case really matter. So it treats very differently from when you're trying to do it as a business. So you have 1 gram of cannabis versus 1 kilogram of cannabis, obviously is going to be treated very differently, because 1 gram you can kind of make a reasonable argument that this is for your own personal use, whereas 1 kilogram is perhaps a little, the presumption there is it's for other people's use.
There's no argument. That's pretty straightforward logic, let's face it. So import-export is a very different case. That comes under smuggling of drugs, and that's a different area.
Yes. However, interestingly enough, in the past, and we have actually seen it here as well, that if you were caught coming in with any kind of drug at the airport, you're also considered as basically potentially importing it because you're coming into the country. You see?
Okay.
So in addition for you basically having possession of it and also maybe even using it if it was in your urine or your blood test, on top of that, because you were coming into the country with it and you were apprehended and caught at the point of entry, you were considered almost by default as importing that drug. Even if it was because there wasn't a difference between personal use versus any other kind of use.
Sure.
And that case would have been treated differently, for example, than if you were caught at a party in the UAE having consumed or having had some cannabis on you. So that was okay. There's basically the usual punishment or accusation would be right away it's possession and or use. Whereas if with the same amount of cannabis you're coming in at the airport, there was always by default an additional charge of this is trading or importing into the country. So it was treated even more severely.
Right.
So now, before I guess maybe let's talk about the consumption of cannabis, because there's another interesting sort of category in terms of the form in which you're using cannabis, right? There's the leaves themselves, and then there's potentially products that contain the leaves.
Okay, so I mean, this is the thing. This is where in other countries, we have an industry that's built up around the different banner of products, if you like. And those are treated differently here as well now, in theory.
Yes. So here, as we're talking about trading, the trading, as we said, is treated much more severely. However, importing, for example, of products that contain cannabis, there's a special designation in the law, once again, that differentiates this kind of cannabis from all the other cannabis. So it's like sort of pure raw form of cannabis or marijuana versus products or goods that contain marijuana or cannabis. So there's a specific category that deals with that separately, and that's in the same law, Article 96, which at a high level decriminalizes anybody who brings in, imports or transports or possesses from abroad any food, drink, or products which contains THC, cannabis, or marijuana for the purposes of personal consumption. So which means, let's say, cream. Right, you have a cream that has some cannabis, or you have a cookie that has. I know that was in college. I know those kinds of cookies were popular, so for example, somebody brings a drink that has one of these sort of variants of cannabis. So that kind of so in the way you're bringing into the country, right, so you could be accused of importing that, but the law decriminalizes that. So it decriminalizes if you bring some kind of a product that may contain one of these cannabis or its variants for personal use, then that's no longer criminalized. However, the item will still be seized, and that's at the point of entry.
I was going to say, so if you come in and you've got a hand cream that you use and it has THC or some form of cannabis derivative in there, it would be seized, it would be taken from you. What then happens to you bringing that in? Because it's perfectly possible you'd be completely unaware that this particular hand cream that you really like and makes your hand soft has cannabis in it.
Yeah, so exactly. So again, and that kind of goes back to our previous point, which still cannabis in the UAE is still illegal. So just because it is in a little amount in a hand cream and you're bringing it for the first time does not make it okay for you to have it in the UAE. Right. So in that case, so the most important thing is that it is no longer a crime to be caught doing this for at least first time around, but you are not allowed to have that product in the country. So it will be seized, and an administrative report will be issued. An administrative report is, for example, something that usually happens at the airport, because at the airport, remember, the airport here is not just the airport. There's the customs, there's also police, there's even prosecution. So the airport has a bunch of other authorities that ultimately have the authority to adjudicate these kinds of cases, and therefore you don't need to necessarily transfer it to court, as was the case before, and therefore complicated and prolonged a lot of these kinds of related offenses or crimes. Now, a lot of these judicial authorities have representation or representative offices at the airport, and those representatives have authority to judge or adjudicate or decide some of these matters on the spot, which makes it a lot more efficient and a lot less scary, right? So as part of this, the authorities at the airport, there's the prosecution or the police or the customs. So what they'll do is they will issue an administrative report that basically will document this particular offense and that you brought this kind of product and it's been seized and this amount has been seized from you, that it's basically, and then there's so now you as a person, you have a file on you. It's not a criminal file. It's not yet sort of a formal file, but it's an administrative file. Right. And so this, by the way, this exception or this treatment only really applies to first-time offenders. And this is how you know. So this is why this administrative file is relevant and it's important. So the first time around, you come with a little cream, they take it off you. You don't feel like anything is sort of happening because nobody's taking you to jail per se. You're not sitting behind bars. You're not giving you a passport necessarily. They just take the product. They'll give you an administrative report. They release you. But there's a file on you. So if you do this next time around again, now that administrative report will obviously no longer be administrative in form. It will be escalated and potentially referred later to the authorities. So there is that condition to this decriminalization of that kind of activity. And also, and as I mentioned earlier, so just having this on you does not allow you to bring it to the UAE and use it here. And so therefore, if you're found to be using this product in the country, that too is still illegal. And it only applies to personal consumption and not for trade. So for example, now you are in the business, you love your cream and it makes you look really young and maybe even smart. And now you want to bring it to the UAE and sell it. So that, and let's say you brought, let's say 10 samples because you want to trade it or to try it on me and my team. So even though it's only 10, that would be viewed more as perhaps trade or import versus personal consumption. And then that would be treated very differently. And by the way, there is no difference with regards to these kinds of activities. There's no difference between residents and tourists. So just because you are a tourist, you did not know, versus a resident who should have known, as far as the law is concerned, there is no differentiation. And I guess everybody will be treated the same way.
Okay, I'm just making a note, actually. Don't get into hand cream for myself here. But the point is, from all of that there, and I take all of that under advisement, it's no longer one strike and you're out, is the point you're making. Yes,
but further, there is more. There are more strikes, I guess, that are allowed, at least, or allowed to without severe repercussions. So, for example, again, this relies, the topic today is only cannabis, any kind of variants related to marijuana and THC and whatever other scientific names are. But then it's also only really for it's personal consumption, I guess. It's not trading, it's not import, so personal consumption, but only even within that category. So there's the punishment is a lot more lenient, but it depends on the number of offenses. So, for example, if you are caught having that kind of basically cannabis per se, but it's for personal consumption, and the Article 42 deals with the treatment in the different categories of punishment. So for first time, again, it's personal consumption of cannabis. First time offenders, the punishment is a minimum jail term of 3 months or a fine of 10,000 dirhams to 100,000 dirhams. So this is important. The or here is extremely important. Yeah. So if you're caught the first time around, yes, you can end up in jail. It's 3 months, and that's minimum 3 months. Yeah. But there's an or there's a fine, and the fine is 10,000 dirhams, which is about $3,000, up to 100,000 dirhams, which is about $30,000. So this is crucial because in the past, remember, there was always a jail sentence of minimum 2 years, plus a fine, plus deportation. There was no or maybe consumption versus possession, a little bit versus a lot.
It's a huge change. When you said "or" there, I was looking at my notes, and it immediately made me look up because, in my mind, if you are caught with illegal drugs here in the Emirates, that is it.
That's how it, yes, was. Now
That's
it's
how it was. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and now it's a
It's a
little
huge
less so.
change.
Absolutely. Now, that's the first time offender. What if it's the second time? So, second time, so the law, again, it's that granular. Now, it sets out, okay, for the second time offenders, and that's within the period of 3 years, by the way, as well. There's further granularity, right? So, if it's, you're only considered a second time offender if you are caught with sort of doing the same kind of offense or crime within 3 years. After 3 years, you'll be still a first time offender. So the second time offender, minimum jail term of 6 months. So it's doubled from 3 months to 6 months. But again, or a fine between 20,000 dirhams to 100,000 dirhams. So the fine here, the minimum fine is doubled, which is from 10,000 for first-time offenders to 20,000 for second-time offenders, but the maximum remains the same, up to 100,000 dirhams. That at least there are some. There's basically you have another chance. And the fact that the range in fines is so significant means that not the court has an incentive to just say, oh, listen, I think you look like the sort of a person that might have known, or probably not your first rodeo, and maybe if you're a resident, or again, the circumstances matter. The court says, I really want to punish you because I don't think this is your first time. The court has a chance of imposing a fine of 100,000 dirhams, not a small fine.
No.
So versus, for example, somebody who maybe like the case I mentioned earlier, someone who just has a little bit, and it's literally just falls out of his luggage, and so kind of looks like he wasn't even trying to hide it. So maybe the court will think, well, in these kinds of cases, it looks like the guy really was just oblivious, had no idea. So maybe I'll 10,000 dirham punishment, or the fee, or the court says, you know what, I think you were fooling me. You knew, you should have known that I'll give you a jail sentence and a fine. So there's a lot more range, but most importantly for the courts now, the fact that they can assign a fine means that they don't have to also burden the legal system in the UAE with throwing these people in jail and making them sit in jail and live off the state, so to speak. So I think it's a huge step forward in terms of just it's a crime, and a crime, you're going to be punished, but in terms of the punishment and the tax on the system, it's a lot more flexible. Now, third-time offenders or more, it says, so the minimum jail term, again, is 6 months or a fine between 50,000 dirhams to 200,000 dirhams. So this is for repeat offenders. And again, it's up to the court. I mean, the fact that the court has this discretion of assigning at least jail sentence of at least 6 months and a penalty of up to 200,000, which is about $60,000. I think it just, again, I guess the idea is to teach people that make it so expensive that to teach people to think a little harder before they come into the country and decide to play with the law this way. So it's a deterrent in a way. It's a punishment and a deterrent at the same time.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense, but it also recognizes the fact that in some other countries, cannabis use is far more regularized, I suppose. It's far more average for a lot of people, and the expectation when people visit the UAE, you kind of think to yourself, well, is it such a big deal? Well, it is still a big deal, but the UAE recognizes that to you, perhaps it's part of your life, and there's kind of a balance there, I think.
I think so. Yeah, you're right. I think it's in no way an acknowledgement of the country that, listen, we are a lot sort of more accepting of drugs now than we were before. It's just like you said, it's more acknowledging that, well, people that are coming from foreigners that come into the UAE and live in other countries, either as tourists or as residents who come to the UAE, that things are different in other countries. And so they're not necessarily criminals in other countries. They should know better. They should learn the law. And this is why we're doing this podcast to begin with. It's just to help people understand the law in the UAE. But at least the authorities here and the legislative system here is a lot more now accepting that, well, listen, people in other countries, it's not as much of a big deal. So therefore, we're going to segregate this type of offense or punishment with that context in mind.
Final thoughts, Ludmila. I guess it's worth kind of rounding off saying, look, none of the previous conversation that we've had today in any way is intended to state that drugs are anything other than illegal here in the UAE. That's a point to, I guess, re-emphasize. But any tips or any advice for somebody thinking of coming to the UAE who may be a habitual user in some way, or tips for residents, I guess, as well, people living here in the UAE?
I'm perhaps the wrong person to ask for advice, because I would say categorically just don't fool with it, don't play with it. It's just playing with fire.
Well, if that's the advice, that's the advice.
That's my advice.
Yeah.
Maybe I am a bit of a stickler, for and the old fashioned and more extreme in my views, but it's just the law is still quite unequivocal that it's illegal. Drugs are illegal here, and the authorities are not encouraging and welcoming of substance. So therefore, just if you choose to come to this country, you should know this is the law, and therefore, if you choose to come here and enjoy the benefits of the country, just don't play with fire. Don't play with the law. Don't try to be creative, inventive, and thinking you're smart, or people who know people. These people are well connected. They'll get me out. Or if I'm doing it at some party of somebody who is well connected or somebody famous, that's going to be treated differently. And in many cases, maybe it is. But it's all good as long as it's good until you get caught. When you get caught, things sort of fall apart. And remember, when we talked about the punishment, there's Article 75 of the law still mentions that courts have a discretion to also, in addition to the other types of punishment that we discussed, to also rule on deportation, to deport the person. So the courts still have discretion. It's no longer mandatory, as it was the case before, and sort of a default punishment, but the court has discretion to do so. So therefore, if you're a resident, to your earlier point, if you're a resident, you live here, you might have done it a few times and you have not gotten caught, but remember that if you are caught, in addition to all the other kinds of offenses, depending on the circumstances, and the courts, especially if you get caught at a party, for example, there could be other witnesses. The courts, in addition to everything else, have the discretion to also order deportation. And once you have a deportation, halas, you leave this country. So for residents, it's a big deal. And so I just say be sensible. Just the UAE has a very, very good connection points to many different places in the world. So if you want to do it in countries where it's legal. And don't rely on people's representations. Oh, it's okay. I know such and such. Oh, I've done this before. And there's obviously an underground market in every country. But my advice is just stay on the right side of the law. Don't tempt your fate. And because we've seen too many cases where, to be honest with you, looking back, the person was ultimately caught, but it was pretty obvious it wasn't their first rodeo. So obviously it works until it doesn't. I did want to share one maybe interesting case study because it kind of plays on this. But this case was prior to the law changing. It was actually during COVID. It's sort of the peak of COVID, is when a resident in the UAE, and so sort of a client of ours, a resident in the UAE had received a parcel, or had been receiving a parcel, or in particular had received a parcel or a package from abroad, from their home country. And in the package, there was just sort of the regular bits and bobs that your, I guess, friends and family would send you, chocolates and special kinds of drinks that maybe are more available in that country, and candles and socks and other kinds of just more habitual sort of house items.
Kind of a care package.
A care package, yes, including the socks. And in the socks, inside the socks, there were vapes. Okay. And the vape had the THC substance ultimately.
Okay.
So it looked like a very innocuous package, but so the person was stopped when they went to pick up the package from the post office, the equivalent of post office here, and they had to sort of open up the package and so the vape was it's a vape. A vape doesn't have in of itself is not illegal in the UAE. It's only illegal if the substance inside the vape is illegal. So in that case, there was cannabis or THC inside the vape, and what was more interesting that. two things. One is that, and when they took the person, because what happens, and this is, by the way, just a general practice, whenever you're caught, be it at the airport or anywhere else, with basically being suspected of having cannabis on you, there will be urine test that's done. Okay. As part of the urine test, they can see whether it's in your blood. So in each one of these cases I've described, there was always a urine test. And so if it is in your blood, then now it's not just possession, it's also use. Right. So now all of a sudden you have two charges. You have use and possession.
Right.
So, and then because it's in your body. And for a lot of these people, I guess those who are more routine users of cannabis would know how long it stays in the body, in the blood. But also remember that. So even if you haven't done it in the last 2 or 3 weeks, I think from my research shows me, and I'm not sure if I'm correct, that it's like 45 days it still stays in your blood. Okay. So just so even if you hadn't used it a few 3 or 4 months weeks before, if you have it on you by accident and the urine test is performed, it's going to be in your blood. So therefore, right away, you have two charges: use and possession. But in that person's case with the little parcel, there was there was a vape that was received from abroad, and then 2, there was, when the urine test was done, there was actual substance in the urine test, which means what? That the person had been receiving this before.
Yeah.
Because how else would this be in the blood before? Because this happened before the package. The package was opened before. Obviously, she had the person had access to the vapes. So, but it was already in the blood. Which tells you that there wasn't the first package. And we think and we speculate that the reason this time around the person was stopped at the sort of the post office was because they must have been followed before. And there's not the first package that had been shipped and had arrived, and this is why this incident, this package was seized, and basically there was a conclusion already. So what was suspected in this package, the urine test was done, and this is why the person also had it already in their blood. So obviously this was not the first time around. And in that case, by the way, it went all the way to the Court of Cassation. The only thing that helped then was that there wasn't. The only thing that helped then was that it was during COVID, so the person didn't have to serve time in jail because at the time the authorities were not putting people in jail. But there was an order of deportation, and the deportation is what we had appealed all the way to the Court of Cassation, but the court was unequivocal about it. And this, by the way, was a long-term resident in the UAE. The court was unequivocal. The only sort of redeeming eventuality or redeeming factor was that they didn't have to spend time in jail as they would have had to do in the past. And this was on the cusp as the laws were already changing, but the incident happened before the laws came into effect. So the person was deported, and on all grounds to try to challenge the deportation just were basically not successful. So that's, I kind of want to leave perhaps with that in mind, and that's to your point earlier about what's our advice. That's a real case in point. It happened. Yeah. It happened to a long-term resident who did not want to leave the UAE, and they had very good counsel. It wasn't just us. There was a whole group of counsel and a lot of support otherwise. And by the way, it was still a care package. It was just a vape or maybe 2 or 3, but it wasn't like there was a massive package amounts of vape that sort of you could have been considered as trading, but the charge was importing. So it was deemed as an import.
And it can happen. And deportation, as we all know, is a bit like owning a pet, isn't it? It is for life.
For sure. And by the way, now, and that kind of to take it back to where we started, since this law came into effect, and a lot more news articles came out talking about the more lenient approach, the UAE's more lenient approach. So we've had a lot of people reach out to us, say, hey, listen, we were deported X number of years. Is there a way to lift the deportation? We've heard that the UAE is going to relax its laws on the deportation, so on drugs. So now, on the back of that, can we now apply and lift deportation? It's a very hard and challenging quest. I guess we have not had a successful one yet, but I'd say our answer right now is like no. You will not be able to lift it, but obviously there are exceptions. And if we do ever have a successful case, we'll most definitely do another podcast on that alone.
Possession of cannabis. That's another episode of Lawgical, drugs in the UAE. Ludmila Yamalova is the managing partner here at Yamalova and Plethka. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
Appreciate your time. As ever, thanks for watching, listening, or both. Thanks to Ludmila. You can find us at LY Law on social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn. You can find all our podcasts at lylawyers.com. And if you'd like a legal question answered, or you'd like to talk to a qualified UAE experienced legal professional, click the contact button at lylawyers.com.